Hello, thank you for tuning in. So this is my second conversation with Filip, and Filip is a philosopher who has studied most extensively Hegel and is part of the Halkyon Gilm, and is teaching his second course there. Coming, I think it starts this weekend. So all the links for that below in the show notes. The other thing is, if you're interested in circling or working one-on-one with me, my email address is below. Talk with me about coaching one-on-one or anything related to circling. All the links for those things are below as well. So this conversation, I really enjoyed this a lot. I think we both lost track of time, which is a really good indication. So I think the thing I want to point out, and maybe how to listen or what to maybe listen for. So on one level, we're talking about Hegel, and we're talking about ideas, and we're talking about things of philosophy. Yet at some point, it takes a little while to get going, but at some point, it felt to me like a demonstration of dialectic started to happen, and even moments of dialogos. So I think this video is a really good example of dialogue moving into dialectic, moving into dialogos. So you can listen to like both what we talk about and all the brilliant things that Filip has to say about Hegel and philosophy. You can also at the same time watch the movement of thinking as the movement of the conversation and watch kind of how it progresses. I thought this one was really neat in that regard. So enjoy. Oh, also one more thing. John Vervaeke, Chris, and I will be doing another Dialogos and Circling course. The first one was a massive success. We will be doing another one. I'll make announcements when that is in the calendar, and give you all the information, of course, on how to sign up for that. So stay tuned for that. Much love. Bye. Welcome back, Filip. Welcome to my computer screen.
Hello, Guy. It's good seeing you here. And thanks for having me back. It's great to be back.
Yeah, it's really good to be back. You're to set a little context, you're about ready to teach your second course at the Halkyon Gilm, correct?
That's right.
Yeah. And the first one was it was an introduction to philosophy, and this one actually is going to be specifically on Hegel.
Indeed, this is going to be like a mature course, I could say, in terms of the depth and the length of it as well.
Yeah.
So the first course was 5 weeks, and it was all just seminars. This one is going to be 9 weeks, and there'll be lectures this time around. So more content, lots more content.
Wow. And and Hegel is the main guy that you studied, right?
It is the main guy that I study. That's right.
Right.
It's one I bet my horse
right.
on, as you said. Yeah.
Totally. I was like, one of the things I was, I turned on, I think it was late at night. I couldn't sleep or something like that. And a video of you and Johannes came up, and it looked, I think you were both drinking wine and it looked kind of late at night over there. And it looked like, and Johannes was trying to describe, I don't know, he was trying to describe the Heideggerian, like the further reaches of Heideggerian thought. And it was really interesting because you were there. I was thinking about Hegel, and then Johannes was there, like talking through like barely intelligible, right? Kind of you know how Heidegger gets, you know, that whatever that you know, let's be ambiguous about ambiguity, but definitely ambiguous, right?
Well, would that make ambiguity more or less ambiguous if you are
Yes.
ambiguous about ambiguity? Because you are kind of instantiating, you know, the thing you're talking about. So you couldn't get more clear about it than that.
Yeah. Well, in this, and this is what I was going to ask you about. It seems to me that there's ways in which, like, Heidegger and Hegel are really different, but then there's other ways when they're not different at all. In that, and this is my tell me if this lines up for you. You know, in that sense that, like, you can kind of, well, I know in the 30s, Heidegger would spend, you know, I don't know, 10 hours a day at his hut, philosophical thinking, right? When he was doing these performative texts, and where he was trying to think being without beings, right? And and in the picture I get from that and of reading those texts is, in some sense, I get the same picture with Hegel when he's doing his logic, where there's what you're using, like what you're using is also what you're observing, right? What you're substantiating is what you're already substantiated in, and somehow in that constituted relationship that kind of presuppose each other, that I guess you could call thinking.
Yeah.
It seems that kind of overhearing, however it is that you could notice thought, whatever that means, and you could overhear it and then start to notice these movements, or these movements of intelligibility. Right. In that sense, it seems like that's where it seems like they're doing something very similar to me.
Yeah.
Do you see that?
Definitely. And I would also almost see it as a kind of general feature of philosophers, that, you know, they're not just talking about something that has happened, or they're telling you about something outside of you. You know, over there you have the street, and over there this and that is happening and whatnot. No. What they're talking about is kind of ongoing, and you're already participating in it. And so you could say there is a performative aspect in philosophy, and you know, the geniuses of philosophy are able to animate this in text, right? Which seems so like an impossible thing to do, because the text is written, it's done, right? So how on earth can you manifest this activity of you know, being there in the thinking, right? When the means you have is a book, right? And books are, it's, you know, they're not thinking. So you're taking something dead and almost performing a kind of necromancy, where you're bringing it to life. So I would just say the performative aspect is definitely something that both Heidegger and Hegel, and I think a lot of major philosophers share.
That being there. Well, I like how you said that. That, I don't know, do you call it act, or that being there in thinking, right? That it's really, you know, because and what you're talking about with reading philosophy, and that's all you really have to work with, right, on some level, is that the process of reading philosophy lights up something, but it's also the thing itself. You can't explain, like, if you measured the book, no matter how much and how many dimensions you measured that book, and you wouldn't find the philosophy. There's this movement that has to be taken up. And for me, because I actually, my own experience, this is how I came into philosophy, was not through academia. I started reading Being in Time at the Barnes and Noble across the street, right? No one ever read the Heidegger book. So like they were basically mine, and I got so compelled, but I didn't understand anything I was reading. But and of course, like the way that you integrate any kind of new experience in your life is you want to talk to your friends, right? Well,
right.
Imagine what it was like to be my friend. And I've always had this, and in some sense it's been kind of a cool experience, because I think it's always kept me awake to the act, if you want to call it, the act of philosophizing, the act of understanding, this kind of movement of it, this participatory being there in it, precisely because I'm around people that have no idea or interest in philosophy, right? And I'm trying to describe this experience I'm having and this stuff I'm reading, and I realize like trying to bring words to it. I've probably lost a lot of friends trying to do that, but what it tells me is that what's strange to think about this is that everyone is walking around at some level living in the very things that philosophy takes up explicitly, right? Everyone thinks, right? Everyone looks out and they see their world is an intelligible world, right? And that intelligible world has a history. It's a different, right? The same view will appear to me differently 100 years ago than now, right? 100 years from now, what will show itself as something will change. And so there's this quality of everyone in some sense is, on one level, philosophy is a conversation in which it's not a conversation that you can have or not have, right?
Mm-hmm.
It on some level, to be a human being is to be philosophical on some fundamental level.
Yeah.
Right. Yet at the same time, like my experience when I started to take up that level in itself and then try to talk about it with people, it's so obscure, right?
It's I get what you're saying. So like Hegel talks about this in his encyclopedia about what philosophy is doing isn't fundamentally different from everyday thinking, because everybody is thinking, using concepts, making sense of the world, orienting themselves. But then when you sort of put this reflection or this thinking, turn it upon itself, it sort of separates itself from itself, because it's no longer the same thing, right?
Right.
When you start to think about thinking, you're not just thinking simply. You almost make a new sort of division or a new way of thinking itself, and that generates a separation from and that could be really disheartening, because as you were saying, you didn't understand what Heidegger was up to when you first opened the pages, but man, there was something there that was magical, that was enticing you, that was exciting. And then you go to your friends and sort of burst out these things, being ready to hand and all of those things, and they're like, what are you on about? And you're like, how can you not be on the same page? Because this is animating you so much, right? And that's the strange thing about philosophy, how it's trying to get to the heart of things, but in doing so, it's kind of separated itself or generated a almost infinite distance, from the presence.
Which is just that movement that you made, this infinite distance, and trying to come close to itself. It generates itself as infinitely distant in some respect, right?
So we're making the struggle,
right? Just that movement, though, I would imagine in Hegel, if Hegel were sitting down noticing that, he'd go, right? And there's something going on there. There's that movement that what is that that's in itself revealing of something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Exactly.
that process where I guess it's the process and the content is somehow the same thing and switches back and forth, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's in my attempt at reading Hegel's logic, and the phenomenology of spirit. My sense has been like, in order to understand it, what you're understanding, and tell me if this is right, like in some sense it's kind of like you're learning, it's a little bit like understanding dance, like you have to move with it, right? Right, there's this movement going on, right? But it's a different kind of, it's a movement of thought, right?
Yeah.
In some sense.
I do use the example of dance in one of my lectures in Hegel. That is in relation to love, when Hegel speaks about love, because there he sees it more as a kind of you find yourself in a unity with somebody else, the one you love, and you come to count for something for them, but at the same time you give yourself up in the sense of you're no longer the center of the universe. You know, you're there for them, so there is a kind of surrender to the other, because you know the other will accept you. At the same time, you don't want to collapse yourself into the unity. You want to remain your own person, your own distinctive character, and so on. And here we have a kind of contradiction. And I was likening this to the push and pull of dancing, right? Where, when, let's say in swing, right, swing dancing, it's important not to be smushed together completely, but it's also important not to be completely apart in a kind of static distance. What you want is a dynamic push and pull, like, you know, almost like a heartbeat that is, you know, keeping things going and flowing. And so Hegel talks about love, and I see Hegel talking about love in these terms. And love itself is a kind of an expression of freedom for Hegel, and freedom itself is I would say, the most important category in all of Hegel's philosophy. So if Hegel is a philosopher of anything, I would say he's the philosopher of freedom. And freedom then in turn is always this dance with what's outside of you, whether that is in your experience of, you know, being conscious of things, or in a, you know, relationship with other people, or your body, and so on. Hegel finds this kind of dynamic, dance dynamic, we might call it now, at work everywhere. Sorry, now I lost my train of thought.
We're talking about movement, right? We're talking about movement of thinking, right? The experience of thinking, this way in which this weird thing that the moment you try to, in some sense, look at thinking, there's this distance that happens, right? And then you just said something about like, and I said, it's kind of like, to read Hegel feels like you have to perform it with him. There's some kind of dancing going on, right? And it's funny because it's a change. I don't know if I want to call it a change in consciousness. It's definitely a change in perspective, because if you try to read Hegel like most people try to read things, I think most people kind of try to read things, you know, like they read the instruction manual, like from IKEA, right? If you try to read Hegel like that, it's just going to look so dry and boring, right? There's actually a thing you have to enter into, such that thing that you're talking about, the heart of what's going on, starts to light up. Right.
So this is a really, you know, you can see this distance viscerally in the activity and the history of philosophy. Because what do philosophers do? They generate their own vocabulary, their own language, their own technical terms, right? And that's, you know, it doesn't help matters in bringing it closer. It widens the gap. if you train yourself and you sort of, you learn the moves that they're making, you'll find yourself that you become, not just any kind of dancer, but the dancer of a specific form.
Right.
And so what might seem at first to be generating a distance, I think ultimately through training and practice, as any kind of skill, will equip you and allow you to then bring you closer to the heart of the matter, which is what you wanted to get at.
Right.
And I like your example of the manual in the IKEA.
Yeah.
So I've thought of this in terms of like as a manual, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But instead of building an object that is outside of you, right, you receive a box, and in the box there is no object. There is only the manual, because the object is you. It's your own thinking, right? And so in reading the manual, you're sort of building the object, which is yourself, right?
Yes.
You are constructing these thoughts, and you're following the manual, see what follows. And if you're following the manual closely and the object, your thinking doesn't align with the manual, well, then maybe the manual is wrong. Maybe the manual needs to be edited here and there, right?
Right.
And I think the tradition of philosophers have basically had the same manual, and they've all been editing in it.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
Adding to it. And so the manual has become really big.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. And then there's these arguments like, it's like, with the manual isn't right. Right. And so that one this is a great analogy. And then so one philosopher corrects it, and the other philosopher goes along and says, no, the manual was right.
Yeah.
The object was wrong. Right. And
so it goes back and forth.
That's a great analogy of this instruction manual, that you are the thing that's you're reading as its structure of construction, right? That's that's the livingness of it, right? That's the livingness of it. And it struck me as I consider that, like that reading it, that's really interesting. That's a way of accessing what we're talking about, right? The experience of philosophy, like in some sense, the practice of it, right? Which is that experience more than the technical understanding was the thing that I think drew me into it and gave me so much, right? But it's very difficult to communicate it. So it's similar, like so similar like saying, like, I do math because the way my mind feels on math is a particular way, right? In some sense, and that my way of minding, like, makes the world show up in ways that it wouldn't otherwise, right? That do all these cool things, right? But really, it's this kind of transformative sense, but also this intimacy, this strange intimacy, right? Which is like, if I'm reading the manual, that's such a cool, I'm going to be thinking about that forever. Thanks for that. But like you're reading the text, and what you're getting closer to is the reader, right? Like what you're reading. And if you really start to read it, you're no longer reading the sentence, you're reading what you're closer to, right? Which allows the reading to become more animated. But it's a strange kind of intimacy, because it is a nearness and a farness at the same time. And then you said earlier about Hegel, like his connection with love and freedom, right? And I can feel those two things happening there. Like in thinking, is that when I move towards thinking, in some sense I come close to something, but when I see thinking gets further away in my seeing, right? So there's this kind of movement of together, and this opening, this freeing from the thought at the same time.
Yeah. It's opening and it's closing, and closing and it's opening.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this reminds me of like how certain religious traditions and have a kind of very strong intellectual tradition, and they find revelation not to be in a kind of just in experiences, which can often be sort of everyday experiences and whatnot, but in the act of reading the text itself can be an ecstatic experience, and ecstatic in the sense of like being outside of yourself.
Yeah.
So there is a not just in philosophy, but any kind of deep written text that has full of insight and profundity, has these sort of experiences that it can animate.
Yeah.
But another thing that I wanted to say earlier, but then I forgot, but I remembered, is that thankfully we're not just we don't just have the text dropped in front of us without further ado. Usually there is a community, there is other people with which we can talk with and communicate, and even if it's friends who haven't read or don't have the same interest, I think the seed of community is already there in going outside of yourself. So like what I'm trying to say is that the text is an important bit of the activity of philosophy, but I think also there needs to be other people there, a community that with which you can discuss and respond these ideas with.
Yeah.
Because we are not all just isolated and sitting and reading the book, as much as certain technological developments would like us to be boxed in.
Right.
I think this aspect of reaching out and bringing out your ideas, because I don't think one really does know what's going on inside one's head unless you bring it out to other people and try to explain it to them.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that shows like how not just like you can say university, yes, but also other kinds of places like what you're yourself doing and what we're doing right now. The importance of communication with other people and forming communities around the text.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And that's that coming to thinking together. You're right. I've noticed that as well. Like if I don't really know what I think until I kind of fuck my way in front of another. And like occasionally they hear something in that, right? And they hear something in that. And then I hear what I just thought, right?
Yeah.
In some way. And there's in that movement of them here, Jordan Hall talks about it like you say something there and it's like 90% noise, right? And maybe 10% signal. And the other person hears that, like hears some of that signal and then says it back, right? And it maybe says it back with 20% noise. I mean, in this kind of going this back and forth movement where in some sense the signal or the intelligibility starts to come to word, right?
Yeah, and the intelligibility itself becomes sharpened and more clear. As you were saying, the signal increases in this exchange. Whereas normally when we think, of physical stuff or material stuff, they decay when they're being used. This seems like the general rule for all things that are in existence.
Right.
With the exception of this, of thinking, of concepts and so on, which instead of diminishing when they're being used, they actually get enhanced, they get better, they grow, right? And so it's a win-win situation that the more you share, the more you get in return.
Yeah. Well, right there, that maybe when he said, and maybe that's the one thing that isn't like that. Had you ever quite put it like that before?
If I've put it like that before?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
This is now coming out.
Did the thing just happen?
Yeah. Did it happen, guy? Holy shit, it's happening right now. I'm thinking.
Oh my God, Hegel's happening.
It's in my mind.
Quick, update the text.
Yes. we need to launch a new version of the manual.
Right. Well, I wanted to highlight that, right, because it was happening, but it was also, in some sense, one of the things I've just so enjoyed about in some sense, dialogue, if you will, right? In where conversation moves into not just talking about the world that's already kind of complete, right, and describing it or just moving those around, but kind of taking up where you talk about what makes the world in some sense, right? And in that conversation, that back and forth, where what we've come to call dialogos happens, right? Where you move from something like, where it's something like, if you following kind of Heraclitus's imagery, well, if we say that we're around a campfire and the logs are something like the propositions, the already thought, right? And you bring the logs in, and then you start to in some sense make them interact, right? And at some point, in this way that no one can really explain or do on purpose, right, it just happens, right? Like the thing lights, and you go from talking about the logos to talking with the logos, in some sense, right? Where in some sense the metaphor of the logs is like, in some sense, the logos is within the logs, and then you start to engage with it, and it lights up and it frees the logos. And then at some point you start to have these moments of thought, that is back and forth, where you say things that you didn't know, which is a strange thing. Like what just kind of happened there. Yeah.
You didn't know it was within you.
Yeah.
Just needed the right catalysts or conditions or facilitations.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what a text plus community are trying to do, right? The text gives you the logs, and the community, they tell you, well, if you put logs like this, they help you make the bring out what's within yourself, which is the fire.
Right. Which is about, I would imagine, why you're not just doing video lectures in your course, but you guys get together and rap about it, basically, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think this nothing is, it wouldn't be a school without that interaction.
Yeah.
I think you could almost say it only becomes formal if you only have the lectures or the text, right? You don't have the substance of the matter, because the substance has to be what's animated with and through others.
Right.
Because as we were saying, right, that's how you discover these things, these gems, these fires within you. Might be more difficult or even impossible to get them out if you're just by yourself with the formal elements, the text or the lecture or what have you.
Yeah.
What's
been can I ask you, what has been the experience of going from, because I'm imagining, is this your first time being a teacher in the courses that you've done in at the guild? Is this kind of the first or the beginning of your work as a teacher of philosophy?
I've taught before at uni, so seminars mostly, and I've been doing tutorings like one-on-one and things like that, but I've never done like a full course and made lectures. So that's a step up in intensity and volume for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is it kind of like a new phase of my teaching journey. A new.
What's that been like? Like you're saying something like, yeah, it's the first step up. Well, I think I'm hearing not just a step up and there's more in quantity of doing something that we can see and measure, but like there's a qualitative moreness there and challenge, I would imagine.
Yeah, I would characterize it as play, because when you're just making a course, you get to be playful, right? What do I want to include? Like you have to get creative, but it's not just creative in the sake of like doing what feels like fun, but it's a creativity that is coupled with responsibility, and I think that adds to the fun, because it's the you have to think, okay, well, what kind of stuff and material do I want to put out, and why do I put out that? Well, what do I think is important for others to learn? What's the best way of approaching this, and so on, right? So a whole host of challenges appear in doing this, but they all demand a creative response.
Yeah,
that's what's really engaging and fun and nice. Which is what I like about teaching,
right?
And especially at this level, is that there is more of that.
Right.
So this becomes a more intense playfulness, and yes, there is more volume, but the qualitative state also changes. Right. I think you are now more in tune with what you're doing, versus when you're just doing seminars or just doing tutoring and whatnot. Even though those engage in the same activity, I think at this level things just take on a more fundamental grounding.
Right. So it's like the thing.
So
I just want to kind of say it back and see if I heard that correctly. It's like, so the things that you were doing as when you were tutoring in the seminars, in some sense, is now the ground upon which at like a higher level of teaching is the ground upon which you play with, right?
Yeah.
And have a creative response from it. What you developed down here, or what you got down here.
Yeah.
And
I think a lot of philosophy itself is generated in some context in teaching.
Right.
So you have Platonic dialogues. What is that? That is people coming together, Socrates and whoever, talking about some idea, concept, and they're unpacking it.
Yeah.
Aristotle's texts, we don't. I think he wrote dialogues as well, but the texts we have from him, I think, are his lecture notes.
Yeah.
And Hegel as well, right? He has the science of logic and the phenomenology of spirit, but the encyclopedia is meant as a handbook to his teaching. So the final published works of Hegel, like the system itself, is not meant to be a text only. It's meant a supplement to his teaching.
Right.
So it's meant. So he actually combines the text, right, and the community aspect, because so it brings them together. I think a lot of this goes around in the major philosophers.
Yeah.
And so teaching is just it seems like to be a good philosopher, you have to at some stage develop your thinking about teaching, or philosophy of teaching for yourself.
Right. Well, just the word philosophy, philia, right, which is like the love of friendship, right, and Sophia, wisdom,
exactly.
Those two things coming together, you're right. And like the and I would imagine, for like a ton of reasons, the philia part, or the relational part, has, I think, in some sense become de-emphasized when people think of philosophy normally. But you're right, it's the Socratic dialogues, the Platonic dialogues. In fact, they used to wrestle together in the Plato Academy. Like that, it was just, that's what you did, right? This kind of wrestling with things as in some sense, a preparation for what you're doing and thinking, right? I think that's fascinating, and it shows how deep relation is in thought, right? And making that connection. And I think that is, in some sense, I feel like that's what I've been coming to and trying to explicate as I notice what I'm doing, which is, it's interesting to talk about that, because you kind of, in some sense, and I heard this in what you're saying as a teacher, because this has been my experience too. In some sense, as a teacher, I guess I'm a teacher in some way, because I understand whatever it is that I'm teaching perhaps more than the students, or that's the idea anyways. However, it's almost like that understanding allows me to play and engage in such a way that I actually find out more.
Yes.
Right.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Yes.
The best thing about being a teacher is that you get to be a student.
Exactly. In almost like a more profound way, like in a deeper way. Yeah.
You finally you get to enter into apprenticeship.
Yeah, totally.
Exactly. Yeah, that's sorry, go on.
No, keep going. Yeah.
The practical aspect of wrestling and doing physical stuff together, that's a really interesting component that was there with the ancients, and it's sort of also there in the medieval period, but I think in monasteries where you have monks and nuns engaging in intellectual activity, but they also have physical tasks that they do. Right, so their life as a whole is this combination of physical work and intellectual work, and the two sort of feed off each other. And that's something we've in modernity, especially in academia, are not so good at, bringing out a physical element and then combining that with the intellectual element.
Right.
So because that would be a more holistic life, right?
Yeah. And without that, the W on the wholeness drops off, right? That's the wrong kind of hole, right? You fall into. But right. And in some sense, I would imagine that this is the idea that Johannes is a part of the idea of calling what he's doing and gathering people together as a guild, in some sense is about a bringing back into the present some of that sense of this way where the philia aspect of wisdom, right? Philia Sophia process, right? Can engage, can start, and these relationships can start to happen, right? That are doing something other than idle talk, right?
Absolutely. And I can speak for myself. Like, I didn't get into philosophy because, I don't know, there were career prospects or it seemed like a useful skill. Right. None of that. Like, that's not how you get into philosophy. You get into philosophy by reading Nietzsche or Voltaire or something, and they talk about will to power, or what is value, what is truth, and these things, they ask questions that pertain to you. You didn't even know how to put the words together for, right? So you get the excitement and the enjoyment first, I think, from philosophy, and then slowly the work starts to become more and more demanding as you weigh in deeper. But by that point, you're committed because you've already found so much in it in terms of joy and of yourself, of your own identity.
Yeah. Right.
So.
Right. Yes.
It's another subversion, right? Usually, in order to get the rewards, the fruits, you have to labor first. Philosophy begins with the fruits first. It gives you a little taste, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, I don't think anyone would ever get into it.
Right.
Because it doesn't have that kind of utilitarian, it's not a means for some other end other than itself.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, it's precisely, in some sense, that you're having a philosophical dialogue precisely because there's nothing useful going on. There's no practical end in itself. There's no like kind of utilitarian gain in it. And this is I think hard to understand, but like this is part of the experience of it. I think what they maybe you can say a little bit about your understanding of this as well, because I've been writing an article based on Scole, right? This which I know is translated often as leisure or idleness. However, like the way it's understood or used, what it points to in the Greek language is not, it is no direct translation. Idleness misses it, right? And leisure misses it. But what's interesting about it is they said, Aristotle said all theoria happens only in Scole, right? And Socrates was saying it. I think it was in the Apology. Like, I actually think you guys shouldn't kill me. I think you should pay me to be in Scole and have all these drive people nuts with these philosophical conversations, right?
Yeah.
And this sense of that, in some way, it's this interesting place. And I think this is to look at what you're actually practicing when you practice philosophy, when you have these conversations. In some sense, Scole is a way, this is kind of, I don't know if I'm totally getting it, but how I would describe my understanding of it is Scole are these moments, this pinnacle of means and end, right? Where what's giving everything is simultaneously what you're holding, and what you're holding in such a way that it turns around and holds you in return. So it has this relationship to time itself. So Scole really basically means, it comes, the etymology in Greek means, I think it's something, it seems to hold, right?
Okay.
So it has this relationship to time. And this is the connection between leisure and idleness, right? In the sense of it retains some of that connection to time, but in the more original sense, that it's a way of being in time where in some sense your relationship to time is one of holding it, and it in such a way that it turns around and holds you. And so in that sense, there's nothing to do, right? There's no doing happening, right? There's just being, and it's being, and the activity of speaking and of thinking. In some sense, there's no difference between the two, because they're all realized, right, in some way. And it has this deep connection to temporality. And what's interesting to me is realizing, like, most of the activities that I have been drawn to, essentially, once I realized, like, I started learning about Scole and understanding Scole, I'm like, oh, those are all the things that those are all the things that kind of draw me into it, despite them being unpractical. And most of them are unpractical as all get out, right? But but then realizing, right, and engaging with them, and then having other people engage in them. Like circling was like this for me, right?
Yeah.
Philosophy is like this for me. Like all of the deep kind of life-changing conversations I've had with people, right, are like that for me. Art is like that for me. It's precisely when people kind of enter into that space or that experience, they realize they have thoughts like, oh my God, I've like talked all my life, but I've never really said anything, right? Like I've spent my whole life as a kind of a means to an end, right?
Yeah.
But and I think we could think about like the activity of philosophy in some way happens in Scole, right?
Yeah.
Where ends and means, it doesn't even make sense to really talk about those in those terms, right?
Well, I don't think you need to dissolve the terms, but you can understand that they become reciprocal.
Yeah.
Where the means and ends are one.
Yeah.
So it almost sounds, I was thinking at first, like you were speaking of a time out that is not timed, right? So it's not something that is, tallied or put under a kind of metric, but it's a space that is sort of given unto itself and not bounded by anything. It's sort of unbounded. But then I thought about, when you were speaking about means and ends, sounds a lot like what Hegel has in mind when he talks about absolute spirit. And that is the understanding that, or the kinds of activities where, the object we deal with is not something that is fundamentally foreign to us, but is what allows us to be at home with ourselves, right? Yeah. So it's something very intimate. And the three experiences he describes in this sphere is an experience of beauty, a religious experience, and a philosophical experience. So he thinks these kinds of experiences are the ones that fundamentally don't have an end outside or a means that is separated from them, but the way they sort of mutually support each other. So, an aesthetic experience or an experience of an artwork or even, beautiful nature isn't such that, you are standing outside of it, but you I'm lost for words, almost like you feel nearer to yourself in and through this, right? Yeah. You don't see yourself as apart from it, as alienated. You come to, understand in a sensuous way that this is you. You are part of it, and it is part of you. Right.
Yeah. So interesting, because as you talk about that sense of, it sounds like there's what you're looking at is what's most familiar, also what grants it the most familiar. Yet at the level that you're talking about, it does have this kind of aspirational quality to it. So it's beyond you, yet most close to you. That's the sense I get as you talk about that. Is that accurate?
Right. I'm not. So I don't know about aspirational, because like it is absolute. So nothing is relative here. So when you have an experience of beauty, you're not reaching out for anything that's not already reached out for, right?
Yeah.
So I would say
maybe inspiration.
It's already realized.
Yeah.
Or it's realized and realizing itself, right? Because it has a temporal dimension. You are having an experience. An experience doesn't just happen in an instant, or a kind of end product that just rolls out and is done. No, you are in a situation for a certain time, right? And in there, what you're basking in is sort of the glory of your mind. I think. Yeah. When you have, appreciate a range of mountains, or an artwork, right? These are things that are outside of yourself.
Yeah.
But you don't experience them as outside of yourself.
Yeah.
The experience, I think, comprehends that a sort of more holistic sense.
Yeah.
Where, the mountain range or the infinity of the sea, the horizon animates the infinity of your mind. Yeah. But at the same time, it is the sea, it is the world. And so it's not something, merely inside of you, but it's also the inside of you coming out into the world. Right. If that makes any sense.
Well, it makes sense, especially when I think about the word spirit.
Yeah.
It's in some senses that it seems that in some way you've transcended subject object.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And when appreciating again the example of a mountain range, right? You understand yourself being in the world, being this kind of creature that can appreciate and have these experiences. So you're not tapping into a cosmic Wi-Fi that is sending signals from outside. You're the one generating it from within this embodied existence, right?
Yeah.
So this thing is working through you, and for in this experience of beauty, you are taken on for the ride.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. As you're talking about it, it's tapping into, all the unspecified experiences I've had like that have this quality of, in some sense, it has this quality of, on one sense, a different experience or a new experience, yet the new experience has this quality of, oh, but this is what's been happening the whole time. And it was obvious. Mm-hmm. I just undistinct in some way. There's this recognition part of it. But also is it fair to say something like what becomes recognized has been what has been most real the whole time? So it's like recognizing what in some sense is always already the case. Like
yeah, I think that's becomes the philosophical mode of thinking about this, right? Yeah, because philosophy tries to articulate all of these experiences, not just the experience of the beautiful, but let's say the experience of the mundane, or the experience of how anything becomes intelligible to us, right? Why, when we have I have some water in the glass here, right? Yeah. But just from the perception, I see the thing is, translucent, has a certain shape, it bends the light and so on, right? Mm-hmm. These are all qualities and terms that I can pick apart in my head. Mm-hmm. And yet they're also put together in me having the experience of the thing. So what's going on there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you ask that question, what's going on there? There's a sense of, in some sense, it's a coming closer to what's going on there, right? Yeah. And this is so just that example. Okay, so first of all, I had this as you were talking about that, when you're like, oh yeah, I can pick all these things apart in my mind, but yet they're all going on at once there. This connection between, in what way is it going on there, and how does it get in here? Such that they seem to have this connection between the two. And I had this imagination, like if we started to open that up, we would end up in this thing called spirit.
Yep, we would end up in this thing called philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And, just to go with that example a bit longer, like, and the thing in, that ends up here, right? Is that different from the thing out there? Right? Am I just making a replica or an image of that thing? Yeah. So it's that I'm not really understanding the thing, but only understanding, appearance of the thing. but not the thing as such, right?
Yeah.
These are like fundamental philosophical, big, heavy questions that it's really hard to get a handle on, even though it's kind of the most obvious thing, and we take it for granted.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's how we can do things before we understand how we do them and why we do them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's the fundamental weirdness that, in some sense, philosophy seems to is the beginning, in some sense, the beginning of philosophizing in some ways, where it's not some grand discovery. It's more like the thing I've always done.
Yeah.
All of a sudden,
yeah,
you realize you don't know anything about it, but you know everything about it. Wait a minute, what does that even mean? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think philosophy and philosophers are like trying to hold on to it. To like hold on to that weirdness. To say, hey, guys, come on, look. Yeah. They're trying to point it out to you. Look at this thing going on there.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And the holding on, I think, also links up with what you said about Scole. Right?
Yeah. Huh.
So philosophers are trying to preserve this space, this weirdness, in its weirdness, and appreciate it and understand it, right? Not to, charter it or paint it over or conquer it or what have you, right? It's just wants to open it up and keep it open.
Yeah, totally. Holding.
Yep.
Holding. It's so interesting. I just had you have kids, right?
Nope.
Oh, you don't? Okay. I was thinking it must have been Johannes's other friend he's talking about. Anyway, I just had a child, my second child. And one of the things what's standing out for me is this kind of deep, at least it's standing out for me more and more significance, or I'm seeing more of the depth, the reality to that there is, my son's name is Teague, and this kind of realizing that there is no Teague. There's Teague being held, right? Like literally, there isn't just no Teague. Like there is Teague being held, like literally being held as he's an infant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or being held in attention or held in the blankets. In fact, if there's a moment, right, where he's not being held in some regard, it's like, it's really clear there'll be no more Teague if we're not careful, right? And that, it just has me think about that sense of like, that in some sense, that's objectively true. But I think it points to, it's laterally true, but I think there's a verticality, an ontological sense of this relationship between vulnerability or openness and holding, right?
Okay.
And because if you think about, human infants are the most vulnerable things that I think that we can comprehend, right? Literally, more than any animal, we're the most helpless, useless, right? Most dependent, right?
Yep. Most demanding.
Absolutely, right? Yet, it's interesting to think about, well, who's on top of the food chain, right? There's this connection between this vulnerability and holding, and how that goes very much can afford this thing that in some senses, like as you move up, in some senses you could say is a resolution, like in spirit, let's say, right? In some way, if we think about, philosophy as a kind of becoming transparent to what is already the case, which is a kind of, that possibility seems to be a kind of porosity or a vulnerability or an ability to become transparent, right? And if we think about it as a process of kind of that vulnerability realizing itself, in some sense, at the highest level, if there's a highest, is this kind of recognition of that there's no difference between everything and the thing that's saying it's everything. And in that sense, it's paradoxically invulnerable, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just
it's
there's these kind of deep links with this vulnerability and this holding and this attunement and philosophy and ontology, and I'm really present to that. This I think it's probably because I'm a little bit older now, well, a lot older than when I had my first child.
That's funny because you say you become older, but now you become more sensitive as well.
Yeah.
To these minute little differences and things.
Yeah.
This vulnerability, which at its highest apex sort of becomes the most invulnerable. It's interesting dynamic, and it reminds me of a book by Zizek called The Fragile Absolute. So we like to think of the absolute as this, overarching, universal thing that just subsists. No matter what. But that's not the case. The absolute has to be kind of brought into being. It has to be facilitated. It has to be activated, and it only exists in and through human-minded activities, through our philosophizing, through our doing of it and thinking and so on. So we, on the inside, it could look almost like it's the most sturdy thing, but actually, it's very soft and pliant.
Right.
And it doesn't take much to overturn it, as recent 20th century history, like when the big wars and so on, like that is just devastating in terms of holding open that space, right? It shuts it completely. And how is that space shut? By big abstract ideals, right? The nation, the race, right? These things that are very superficial in their nature. That's the kind of stuff that shuts out the space of what you were talking about, where you can have Scole.
Yeah.
And another thing that, because what was your child's name? Teague?
Yeah.
Teague. You name the child Teague, but then child doesn't know it's Teague.
Right.
It won't know anything for many years to come, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like a placeholder, the name, right?
But
holder. Implicitly, the child learns, oh, I am actually Teague, right? And more and more sort of things trickle in of their identity. Maybe they like, apple pie. They don't like liver meat and so on, or they don't like this and that. So more and more of themselves kind of come in to their being, and in which their being becomes more and more concrete. But all of that is to say that the spiritual development is something that comes in later than the natural development.
Right.
But Hegel bring this with the Hegel, he characterizes it as a second birth. And what's important here is that it's a birth that has to be like nobody can give you that. So being born naturally is kind of something that happens to you, right? You didn't choose which family you were born with, where you were born, what time. But the spiritual stuff is the stuff that you bring into being through your own volition, your own will,
your freedom.
Nobody can give you your freedom. You have to give it to yourself.
Totally.
And that is the big, for Hegel, kind of the big demarcations of being is the natural stuff and then the spiritual stuff. Right. The spiritual stuff is what gives it to itself. And so he kind of characterizes it as a second birth. And what's important here is his habits. So
habits.
If you
say more about that, habits.
Habits. Because he characterizes habits as he calls it second nature. So some habits you get from your circumstances and environment, but you're the one who have taken those on implicitly. But then you can explicitly take on habits in terms of like, learning to play an instrument or learning a new language, right? At first, these things are super alien and foreign, but through time, through practice, you habituate yourself to them, and then they suddenly just become part of you. They're like, oh yeah, pick up the guitar, play the chords. You don't even need to think about your arm, just do the thing, what you want to do. And the same can also be said for philosophizing, for opening and holding the space of Scole. That is itself kind of a discipline or devotion, a skill.
Yeah.
And Hegel thinks that's in his thinking about social reality and ethics and practicalities and politics and so forth. He thinks the most important stuff is not figuring out values and evaluating, it's habits, because it's in habits that most of our life is governed through. The implicit stuff we do.
And if those habits, this is really interesting. I heard Ivo Di Gennaro talk about the habit of philosophy, it being a habit, right? And I heard it like a practice, like there is this practice part of philosophy and the saving of phenomena, right? The holding of phenomena and a holding open, right? Because if you don't actually name it, which a name is a kind of holding, it's a placeholder, like with Teague. There's a really interesting kind of catch there, that if you don't name it, there's no holding. If there's no holding, like you can imagine how many little moments of spirit like opened up that never got a name, right?
And now they're lost.
And so it's so interesting to think about that there's habits that there's like these deep being in the world habits, right? Like the ones that you can come to already participating in, right? Before you even are conscious of it, right? You come into consciousness with a first name and a last name and a bunch of concerns and an accent and a language. And in some sense, they hold the being that you are. And yet there's that holding, in some sense, it's a concealment, but it's also the depth of that being, right, is precisely a way in which not everything is held in that being. Thus, we're concerned, right? In fact, then you realize all those habits of holding those concerns, right, in some sense mirror, right, what isn't grounded, right? And so this is interesting. Now I'm starting to kind of think through a little bit of kind of Heidegger in Being and Time, how he talks about like, well, there's the inauthentic way of doing that, which is just pretending like just keeping everything and going, all the habits and going. Or there's the authentic way of being, where you stand, in some sense, you take up the uncanniness itself and make it a concern, right? In some sense, speak from it, which starts to sound like, and from that, you can start to make these habits that are precisely habits of spirit?
So the habits, so some habits you've sort of implicitly taken up without you knowing it. But then you can come to learn that, hang on, I can plan new habits from my own, just whatever I want or whatever I see, whatever motivations I have, I can plan and implement those upon myself and develop and so on. But then you can even take it a step further and say like, well, how is this, how does it all hang together? Because there has to be some other kind of grounding habits that give way to the ability to take on other habits and so on, right? Such as, learning a language. That's kind of like has to be given to you or facilitated to you very early on. Yeah, the funny thing about habits, I find them as like, I like to think of them as kind of an immersed consciousness, right? So good to go back with the example of the guitar, right? When you're first learning to play, you're very conscious about where you put your fingers, the distance, how it all feels. Like all of this, you have to put enormous amount of energy, and everything goes very slow, right?
Yeah.
But little by little, things in your mind sort of like get sort of deposited and compressed and basically learned, right? And so you spend less and less time on being conscious of those things, because it's almost like your fingers have now become conscious of them. So they do that for you, right?
Yeah.
They are mindful of, your body becomes now mindful of those things. So you don't have to, you can be mindful of other things.
Yeah.
So the consciousness kind of becomes cemented.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another example can be like learning to drive, right? When you first get into a car seat, so many things you got to be aware of, and you think like, how can I possibly learn all of these things, together? Because it's just so much. It's like a storm.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the mind has this ability to figure it out, implicitly, and you can discover that implicitness about yourself and understand that, yeah, I won't understand it all at once, but if I persist, if I persevere, if I take it step by step, maybe develop a system where I realize the things that break down, I put more attention to those, less attention to things that don't work out.
Yeah.
It's funny how we manipulate ourselves that way.
Right. Yeah, it is really interesting. And you're right. Most of our experience of being is present to hand. It's like most of it is implicit, right? So interesting. And when you like my experience, I notice is like when I really get in touch with how much intelligibility is condensed within almost everything. We think, it's funny. We think we look out and we see sensory data or objects. We really don't. Like we see what's intelligent, right? We see the face of the world, right? And it speaks to us in some sense, right? We don't see the shape of the letter or the sound of the voice. We actually hear the sentence that's being said, right? This is not material data. It's actually intelligibility itself. And you get the historical layers that come through that. And for me, it's interesting when I really get in touch with that. The only true response I have to that is something like gratitude, like it's some kind of deep, profound sense of gratitude, right? Yeah. So much is going on, even in myself. I go on, right, in ways that if I had to kind of consciously think about it and know about it, I wouldn't live. Like your breath. Your breath is interesting because it's like one of the few things that it's involuntary, that you can take over voluntary. But if it was all voluntary, I'd exist maybe 5 minutes.
Yeah, we would, if we were in charge of, how the heart beats, we'd probably give up pretty quickly. Yeah, totally. And if that's the case, we joke about it, but just imagine then what kind of insane perseverance is constantly that is in charge of the beat of the heart, right? There is a kind of intelligibility there that is really so probably the most determined thing you can think of. Yeah. And then think about all the other operations in the body and so on, right? Or even what's going on in how your brain functions and so on. Like there is a lot of determined intelligibility at work there. So to give rise then to the thing that thinks it. Yeah. Right. And in some sense, it's kind of interesting. I just keep getting, as we're talking, these strange, cool developmental paradoxes in some sense, like this
boom, 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 boom. I've never thought about the heart as like determined in that sense. That's really true. It's like, I don't know anything. It just keeps going and going and going and going, right? And it gives everything that's
Right.
me. And it has this quality of, right? It's so interesting to think about it in terms of intelligibility, but it's really
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And that, yes.
so when you were saying that, yeah, you notice that there is so much intelligibility that is implicit and,
Yeah. That's what we were
in
saying
immersed
before.
form around you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you sort of see like, well, this is really what's guiding the world, right? It's not explicit consciousness. It's more implicit consciousness, you could say, right? The unconscious, right?
Mm-hmm.
So on. And I think good philosophers, the great philosophers, they recognize this. And so what becomes really important for them is we need to be super responsible about what bits of our explicit consciousness becomes implicit, because this is the bit that's going to be taken up by others. This is the likely bit that's going to live on through generations. And so Hegel speaks lots about in ethical life. He speaks a lot about customs, about habits. These are the things that guide people in their everyday, not norms and rules.
Right. Yeah. In fact,
So
Hegel was the first
yeah,
one that really emphasized or highlighted in a central way precisely that we don't operate to determine the rules at all. We there's no rules that we read from. It's this living dialogue or dialectic, right?
yeah,
That's
that
implicit.
that's implicit, the implicit bit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we grow out of that, and that is what enables our living and our life situation. Then when we are thinking about changing the rules, because it is intelligible, right? There is rationality going on in there.
Yeah.
But we want to change it, we want to develop it.
Yeah.
But then we have to also think of, well, we're not just changing things on an explicit level. That's not where the action is. It's on the implicit level. So how does this stuff then get filtered down to the implicit level?
That's where we talk about philosophy is the second order of habit. When philosophy becomes habits of freedom, if you will, right?
Yeah.
When it becomes habit, is it kind of in some sense kind of it's a new level or order that starts to sink down into the implicit. I just saw that visually. Is that accurate?
Yeah. It could be. It depends on the philosophy and the philosopher, right?
Right.
But philosophy by its very nature is an extremely explicit activity, because it's all about articulating and making explicit. But I think some of the most explicit stages is recognizing that the explicit and implicit are bound together, and that if you're thinking about others, you need to think about perhaps more emphasis on the implicit level, right? So as we bring this back to teaching, right? When you're teaching your kids, or you have students, you're not giving them the most explicit description. You're breaking it down and simplifying it, and you're giving them something, a stepping stone which they can work on. So you've kind of made the thing implicit there, so that they can make their way up to the explicit.
Yeah.
And now think of that process on a grand scale, like on societal level, on the historical level. What's been going on with human beings, the past few millennia.
So I'm curious. I also, when you that thing that connection that you made about, when you recognize that actually we're not just in a bunch of matter. No, we're in levels and layers of intelligibility, right? That is actually running things most of the time, right? Therefore, and then you said, and really good philosophers recognize this, right?
Yeah.
They recognize that there's movements and there's a way that it's shaped, and see the importance of that it's running the show, basically. Therefore, they respond in a way consistent and attuned to that importance or that recognition.
Yeah.
And I heard in that like a respect and an ethos in response, and how you heard that, right? There's this kind of way that in some sense philosophers articulate the intelligibility of what runs the world, right? Or what has been running the world in some sense, right? And that's that is the stuff of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And is that recognition, and speaking to that recognition, is that what Hegel is doing when he starts to talk about history? Is history in some sense his way of recognizing that through time? Because just like Hegel and history and the way he talks about history, I've heard so many different things about it, right?
Yeah. No, I think that would be quite right in Hegel's way of thinking about history.
Yeah.
So it is about recognition and seeing the intelligibility and the patterns and the necessities that have been at work, and how things operate and do the stuff, right? However, we're not content with just understanding and seeing things. We also want to change them. We also want to manipulate them. We want to do stuff with stuff, right? Because stuff offers itself in certain ways to us as means for some ends, right?
Yeah.
And in some respects, this cannot but go on because, right, food is the kinds of material means for whose end is our own, continuous survival and so on, right? So those logics are at work. So I think Hegel will also want to recognize that, yes, we want to discern and understand and see how things work, but we also manipulate and exploit those things and change them, right? Yeah. So the natural world has predators and prey and all that stuff. And we don't seem content with just being in a world where that is the norm, where that is the rule. We want to supplant it with civilization. Everybody follows, behavior and norms and are nice to each other because that benefits them more than if they were in a state of nature where everybody's out to get each other. Maybe in some societies, human societies today, we still have too much of that. So, there's more work, more understanding and explication to do. Yeah. But Hegel recognizes that there is a desire to change things, and that we have been changing things. But where is that? Towards what is that change going towards? Right? Yeah. What is all this changing and manipulating for? Well, Hegel thinks this is all on the development of self-determination or freedom. Yeah. So he thinks history is human consciousness becoming aware of its own freedom. That's what he thinks human beings have been sort of striving towards and coming to know themselves through.
In this freedom, I get the sense that when Hegel talks about freedom in the way that I think you're referencing it right now, in this conversation, and I've always gotten the sense with Hegel, like when he's talking about freedom, he's not talking about just open space where anything can happen. He's actually talking about something that actually it's hard work to realize, right?
Oh yeah, very hard work. And the bloody human history shows that it's hard work. He is not taking those things lightly. He speaks of history as a slaughter bench, because it just is that difficult to come to this understanding, to this thought that, well, what all of this is for is so we can live in a free society and so on. There's a nice example I saw from another philosopher from a recent talk, and the way he characterizes freedom there, or self-determination, is not something that happens in an isolated space apart from things. It's more of that you're in a situation and something happens and you do that, you do something with that, but what determines what you can do is your own experience and your own skill set and your own training, right? So the example he gave was, you have a drummer, or you have a guitarist, and there's a jazz band, and there's another famous jazz player then, who is like legendary. He's way good, right? And then the guy who is a novice, he plays an arrangement of chords and so on, and then he strikes the wrong chord, and everybody knows this doesn't fit, right? It's wrong. It ruins the thing, right? But the guy who's legendary, he hears it and it's like, okay, doesn't work, but I'll now do this, such that he makes it work.
His response.
And the legendary guy, like, he couldn't just do that spontaneously out of nothing. He had a lot of training and experience to come to that point where he could do such a thing and to be in a situation like that. So all of that is his freedom coming to fruition, where he can, I'm gonna make it work, that chord.
Right.
And then people were like, he does the thing that makes it work, and people are like, oh, and then the perspective switches, right? Whereas first people were like, this doesn't work, right? Now it's like, now I see it. This is amazing. This is brilliant, right? So it's a total 180.
Yeah. That
looks like something that flatly wrong doesn't work.
Here's the dance, right?
Do a little bit of a tweaking to it, add something else. Now it does work.
Yeah, there's the dance. Like, because what I'm hearing is the freedom in this case is the brilliance in response to for what was prior a mistake, and a transformation of that mistake in the response. It's like, I feel like it's like that's how I'm hearing is this. I'm getting the sense of, like the freedom that is hard work that rarely happens, right, is deeply, deeply a response in the world. Because it's like, you talked about it, like on one level, there's the one part where, he couldn't just manifest that out of thin air. It took years and years to be able to practicing of that. And there's also like, he couldn't manifest that without the mistake, right? So there's this kind of way where it's like the world, it's a deep relationship with the world, and it's all of it's in its contingencies, but yet responding to that way that is, in some sense, God, it's interesting to think about this. In some sense, it's responding to the contingency in this example in some way that its response is a discontingency, right? That unfolds it in new ways that grant forms of intelligibility beyond what even his response was, right? Goes beyond itself.
So a great word you bring out is contingency, right? So in the mistake, when a mistake happened, it looks out of place. It looks like a contingency. But then the guy who makes it work, right, he makes it into a necessity, right? So now it maybe become like, we've discovered a new intelligibility here, right? Where this thing that follows upon that makes complete sense now. This is the thing to do. And so, this is the Hegel's point about necessity and freedom. Like, freedom and necessity are both more like two sides of the same coin. They're not opposites, because freedom is what brings into being necessity, or to recognize necessity around itself. Because otherwise you're just dealing with contingencies, stuff happening. But we're not interested in just stuff happening. We're interested in, why does this stuff happen? Like so, and etc.
And in this case, the freedom. So this is really interesting. What we're coming around to is having me understand what I've been understanding even more, about so for me, it was, probably 3 years after I started reading Heidegger. And I didn't understand what it was like, why I was doing it, how it was connected to anything else. And then I saw, like 3 years later, in all of this, I started reading Heidegger at the time that circling kind of started. That was kind of spontaneous too. And 3 years later, I start to realize, and I start to listen to the language, and I start hearing philosophical terms in the practice of circling.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, and it's interesting because I realized this, that in some sense, doing that work of philosophy really was, in some sense, it taught me how to listen, right?
Yeah.
It taught me how to see, and that's and then respond it, because you can only respond to things that you see. You can only
exactly.
You can only respond to things that you can hear the address of, right?
Yeah. What is already intelligible to you? Yeah.
Right. And so there's, and what's interesting about listening, I think listening is an untapped, unrecognized capacity. I think I think listening is something that is so much more profound. Well, because it's listening, because it's like kind of the silent partner, right? And everything that doesn't give, it never, it doesn't wear any clothes, right? So, dressing it so that you can hear it or see it is very difficult. But I think what philosophy really has done for me, anyways, is not so, it's not so much such that I can say cool things, but so that I can hear things that I wouldn't be able to hear otherwise, right? And so in that sense, like Miles Davis, like he could hear the mistake in such a way that his addressing it turns it into a necessity, right? Into new forms of intelligibility, right?
Right.
That attunement. And what's interesting, here's what brings it back to, I think, what you're saying about, or what maybe Hegel's saying about habit. So listening and hearing, like the root of it goes back to the Greek word hearkening. And my understanding of hearkening points to a deep, like a radical form of obedience, right? And if you think about what it takes to in that obedience. Now, usually when we think of obedience, like you usually think about it like the thing we're being forced to do, but that's not my understanding. No, to deeply obey to something, right, is a kind of conformity to what you're obeying towards that is that can only be done with an act of freedom, right? It takes so much freedom to be able to obey something so deeply, right?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. I'm hearing these things start to connect here in this conversation that in deeper ways of like, something like habits, right, are this deep, in some sense, you could almost say that they're a deep, unthematic, maybe at one point was thematic, right? Probably philosophically at one point was very thematic, but as you deepen it, at some point, that, just like with your teaching, that which when you were a student and you were reading and you were doing seminars was explicit as thematic, now as a teacher, those things are habit, and now you're playing, right? You're playing in revealing that ground and furthering it and learning whole new levels of it. But to think about this kind of connection between hearkening and habit, right? Just
it's interesting, the term obedience. So because like you put a lot of trust in your habits, they are sort of at the service of self-conscious, if you like to think of them in that way, right? they are what enable you to do the things you want to do, like playing guitar or dancing or whatnot, what have you, right? Or read philosophical text, right? There is a skill in the reading and how you read and articulating it and so on. And as you say, it takes a lot of, there is freedom involved there because, rocks, would we say that, rocks in an asteroid belt that are going around in that particular pattern, would we say that they're obeying the laws of gravity? They couldn't do otherwise no matter what. So they're just like, it doesn't become a question. It seems like it becomes more of a question for something that is self-conscious and could do otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so obedience maybe is actual only in those circumstances. So it does take freedom. But what do you think about the term devotion? Because we could think of other neighboring terms here. So you have obedience, and then you have discipline, and then you have devotion.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I've been a big fan of
devotion. Interesting. When you say that, devotion has me look, in some sense, it's something I can see, but also it's almost like a horizon. Like there's something aspirational in it. There's something inspirational in it.
Yeah.
It's such that I'm devoted. It has this quality of like, I'm involuntarily drawn towards it. But that involuntariness speaks to, it speaks to the beauty or something beyond that I can, that draws me towards it. But it also has this quality of like, I would volunteer for it, right? It's got this voluntary, involuntary sense, both at the same time, right?
Yeah, it's got the double sense going on.
Yeah.
It's both, you feel it both as a necessary call that you freely accept and choose, and that you would freely choose anyway, right?
Yeah.
I feel like obedience and discipline, they seem to emphasize more the necessary bit,
right?
That you do something for something,
yeah.
Even though at the end of it, right, what you're doing it for is for yourself,
right?
But also not. You're keeping both perspectives, and I see this with the imagining here and thinking about devotion. It is something that sustains the devoted person being devoted.
Yeah.
But they are also there not just for themselves, they're there for the thing, because they're precisely devoted to to whatever it is they're devoted towards, right? Which is outside of them.
Yeah.
Devoted to the community, or devoted to the text, or the activity, or what have you, their nation, or the what have you, their family, right? Interesting term.
Yeah, I'm hearing in both of those, something's lighting up too about John Vervaeke highlights this a lot. So as Chris must have been talking about the Platonic sense of the eidos and the aspect, right, of the of the beyondness of things, the inexhaustible fount of intelligibility, if you will, that there's like all things have an aspect to them that can't ever be fully summed up or recedes, right? Yet there's always these particular aspects that are the particular form that it is, right, that show up. Yet what gives it its intelligibility, its wholeness, can't ever be completed in some sense. So the two terms that they've kind of come to around that I've heard them speak a lot about, which I really like, which is it's these moments are like the peak moments for us, which are where the moreness and the suchness become simultaneous, right? The inexhaustible intelligibility which animates in the particular suchness, and it is they mutually afford and open each other, right? And I'm hearing this in the word devotion, right? These two things of that, I'm devoted, which you have this kind of sense of habit, groundedness, repetition, like showing like this kind of very, very concrete sense to it, right?
Yeah.
Yet devotion, like this beyond this, that what's calling that forth is whatever is lighting up beyond the horizon, right?
Right.
That grants the ground that I'm standing on, moving towards it. Seems like there's this kind of quality too of like longing, right? The difference between like a longing and say a need, right? I think it was who was it? Levinas, who talked about the yearning and longing are really, you can only yearn and long for things that can never be attained, right? In some sense, like when you long for God or yearn for God, right? You're yearning for things that could never be an object that you can come into possession of, such that the longing itself and somehow is a kind of it's a kind of presencing of what you're longing for, right? In this deep way. And I'm hearing that too in obviously in devotion, right?
Yeah. Would it be correct to say that in the case of Levinas, it's like, yes, the structure of longing is such that you cannot, the object, it becomes unattainable. However, the experience itself is present with you, and only you, with the mind you have, can have such an experience, because it's a manifestation of your own infinity. The infinite gap you feel there is the infinity sort of already within you. And I think then that the devoted person has that, but also is aware that this infinity is within them. And so they are simultaneously far away from themselves in this beyond, as well as at home. It is intimately present with them, and they know that this dynamic is what sort of through which their devotion revolves around.
At home.
So I almost see like a dialectic in going from obedience, discipline, and devotion, where obedience is kind of the immediacy of devotion. It's the externality of it, right? It's the minimal form of devotion. It's like devotion without yet knowing you're devoted. But you're on the way there. And then discipline is like further on the way, where you're like, yes, you do this, more rigorously, more systematically, and so on. And you know that you're not just obeying something out of necessity outside of you, you're also building your own necessity from within. And then the third tier, devotion is like, well, this is what I've been already going through with obedience and discipline, but now I see that it's my own freedom that's been grounding this, and the infinity I feel is the infinity that's always already been within me. So you've been realizing this beyondness, this infinity at the beginning, and then you realize that you have that the implicitness of it, right? Becomes explicit now.
Totally. And that's when you said home, it kind of comes in some sense, you realize in that lighting up, that's so that speaks to so many things that I call good, right, in my own life, is this sense of, and then you recognize what has always already been the case the whole time, right? It's like you almost get a new history. Like you look back and you're like, it was obvious the whole time, but it wasn't at that time. But you realize it was unmanifest, but hinted at, right? But yet realized here, and then it reorganizes even like your history. I've noticed that with people.
It gives you history in a way, right? It turns the past into history.
Right. So interesting. So this
I was
seems
also
to
thinking.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, if we put it into a nutshell, devotion is where being in an odyssey already brings you home. Because an odyssey is the journey, right? But we think of odyssey going towards the homecoming, but no, the odyssey is the homecoming.
Yes. That's the embodied paradox, right? And all of that. So this speaking of home, this seems to be a good place to start to come to completion in our dialogue.
Yeah, it's wow, time has flown. I didn't see it.
Right, totally, exactly.
Yeah, we were holding on really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just with that sense, right, everything that we're just talking about, right? I would imagine, if I were to ask you right now, in terms of like, if we say that your relationship to becoming a teacher and teaching in philosophy, I would imagine you would say is really it's a devotion, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if you were just to kind of give a shot at saying, from the infinite limited place that you're at right now, what is in your work as a philosopher, right? What are you devoted to in that? What is that which that work is a devotion, an expression of for you?
The immediate thing that comes to mind is the truth.
Yeah, right.
And the truth must be free.
Yeah. Good talking with you today.
It's great being here, Guy. Thanks a lot. This is amazing.
Absolutely, really amazing. All right, my friend. Just go ahead and send me the stuff that you want to, like, all the information with the class, so that people can that want to do it, they can get the links and stuff like that. Okay, and send it to me an email. I'll put it in the show notes. Okay, great. Yeah, if people want more of this kind of stuff, they know where to look for. Absolutely. Where to go. All right, my friend. All right, Guy. Have a good time. Thanks. See ya.